request to record this. So it's being recorded. If you want to make yourself invisible to
yes.
record this. So it's
I don't want to be visible on it.
So if you want to make yourself invisible, you may do that. If you don't want to be, if you want to show up in that setting, like the so that this is all just part of our consistent series on different topics in Jewish law and Jewish practice that are semi-deep dives over the course of an hour to look at something that might be on people's minds or that comes up occasionally or that people ask, what does Judaism say about X? This is how we get to address it. One of us has to be muted if you're, because we're in the same spot.
Oh, I thought I hit.
So this and this is after we did last month. We talked about abortion, and this week this month we're going to do organ donation, which really just came up because people asked. People asked for. Asked me relatively frequently, or not infrequently, I should say, about organ donation. And the end of it is that the answer is yes, post-mortem organ donation is strongly recommended by the Jewish tradition. And that's so that if you tune out before the end, you know it. And also, like, that's the key thing to know, is that there is a something of a myth in the Jewish that goes around in Jewish circles on organ donation not being desirable. We'll go through why that's not the case and how that sort of got to be the case and what modern perspectives are sort of across the spectrum. So with that, does that make sense? Do people have questions before we leap in?
Yeah, is there any distinction between, like a kidney transplant, which is between two live people, and a heart transplant, which obviously is only one live person? Is there a distinction made, or is it just, is like one preferred over the other, or just any, any is okay?
We will, we'll get to that sort of thing. Good question. So thanks. We'll make sure to try and address that neighborhood of question. Now, what I'm going to do is a couple of things. One, we have, as we often do, a source sheet. That's, I'll both have that in the window over there, and and I'll share my screen. We're going to start out. So the link to this is in the spot, and it should be on your screen anyway. And well, we'll do this. Where am I? I will try, but I can't promise. Unmute yourself, and I will mute myself.
Okay, I have unmuted myself. Hi guys, how's it going? Whoop. You haven't muted yourself. Okay, cool. You guys hear me okay? Okay, I'm gonna unmute you, so if there are any questions, I can hear you now. Okay, our starting point is, as we like to do, we're going to start with what are the, okay, all of a sudden it's in the Post-its as opposed to the form.
Yeah, which one do you want?
Gosh, I think the less colorful one. Yeah, there we go. Thanks. Okay. So like, as we like to do, we like to start with what are our guiding principles when we are talking about an instance of, something in modern Jewish law and modern Jewish life. What are the ancient Jewish precepts that are guiding our decision? So we're going to start with preserving life, right? We talk about how in Judaism, our first and foremost concern is to make sure that human life and life in general is preserved. We say, uvacharta b'chayim. So we're going to take a quick look at these sources. that say, so you shall keep my laws and my rules in order to do them and live by them. So yeah, so it says Ha'adam v'chai bahem ani Adonai, right? And the punctuation mark, right? We say ani Adonai, God says, I am Adonai, your God, to punctuate these moments. There's actually a whole lesson we could do on when God says that in the Torah and when God doesn't say that. So table that for questions for later or another course. But the very guiding principle that comes from right here, where from Vayikra, sorry, my thing is printed out really small, so I'm going to look over here at the screen. So can you guys hear me okay? We're good? Okay, cool. Vayikra. So in Vayikra, in Leviticus, you shall keep my laws and my rules in order to do them and live by them. I am Adonai. It's no good if you follow a commandment and don't live, because you can't follow further commandments if you're not alive to do them. So that is our very overarching principle, is that with the guiding principle behind why we do what we do, when we do God's will, is to make sure that we preserve life. Okay, so the follow-up to that is also from Vayikra. It says, do not be a talebearer among your people. Do not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. I am Adonai. So there's two different precepts that come up in this particular verse. The first one is, and they're connected, and there's a lot we could say about why they're connected, but you're not supposed to go around gossiping or tattling or saying bad things about other people. And the corollary second piece is the part that's relevant to our conversation tonight. Do not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. You're not supposed to sit by and be a bystander, right? We use this text when teaching our young folks a lot. You're supposed to be an upstander, not a bystander. What does that mean? It means that when something is going wrong for your fellow human being, you're supposed to do something about it in the figurative sense, but here also in the literal sense, meaning that you're not supposed to stand by and do nothing when you could help save a life. Do not stand idly by literally the blood of your fellow. Don't let a person die if there is something that you can do to help. That is a guiding precept of our Torah. Can you scroll for me a little, Rabbi? Perfect timing. Good. Now, the Mishnah Torah, this is our good friend Maimonides, who took the books of Jewish text that talk about the legal stuff and made it, he called it the Mishneh Torah. It's a second iteration of Torah, where all that explication in the Talmud and all these texts, which is very varied and all over the place, he sort of took it and codified it into sections that were listed by subject. So here, this is on murder and the preservation of life. Anyone who can save and does not save a life transgresses, do not stand by the blood of your neighbor, the piece from Leviticus we just read. So too, one who sees his friend drowning in the sea, bandits attacking him, or a bad animal attacking him, not good animals, I guess that you can stand, I don't know, or a bad animal attacking him, and he is able himself to save him, or he could hire others to save him, but he does not. One who hears idol worshipers or informers plotting harm for him or laying a trap for him, and he does not tell his friend and inform him, or if he knows that an idol worshiper or a thug are on their way to find to his friend and he could appease them on behalf of his friend. I love that. Like if you could, the thugs are on the way and you could stop them, you're supposed to stop them, right? Appease them in some way, right? I love that. To change their intention, and he does not appease them, or so too any similar case, one who does any of these transgresses, do not stand idly by your neighbor's blood. So based on the examples we have in the Mishnah Torah, where do you think we're going with this? What are some modern examples of these opportunities to help and not stand by the blood of your neighbor? Anyone?
Well, yeah, I'll give a shot at it.
All right, go for it, Mark.
So it says that not only are you able to do these things, but more than that, you have an obligation to do it. So maybe with Alan's question before, yeah, maybe you're allowed to do a kidney transplant, but maybe you're also obligated to do it based upon certain, pros and cons. But this seems to be saying that it's not just you're permitted, but you're obligated to do stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Perfectly said. I couldn't have said it better. Not only are you permitted to do things like we talk about, right? There's a famous line that we'll get to about that the saving of a life pushes off or trumps, or I guess supersedes is a better word than that, supersedes even Shabbat, right? Shabbat is very holy. We put a lot of stock in observing Shabbat, but saving a life, you are obligated to break Shabbat, as it were, to save a life. So it's not just something that is a good idea. It is something that we are commanded to do. Two, if we have a way to save someone is being attacked by a thug, being attacked by these bad animals, being attacked by a friend is drowning. If you have the ability to help or get help, you are supposed to do that. So again, if you're driving on the highway, God forbid, you see an accident, you whip out your phone and safely if you're driving too, and call 911. It's an obligation that one could read into the text here. Cool.
What that paragraph hides, Jack, what the paragraph doesn't address is your own degree of risk that you take in order to perform whatever action you're about to perform.
Right. It's a excellent point. Notice that there is a degree of, like, the diving in to save someone from drowning implies that there is a degree of risk you have to take, meaning diving in to save someone from drowning is riskier than dialing 911, right? Like, one has essentially zero risk. That's not something I leave by. He reads more into it, where it's already that you have to put yourself at risk. Now, like later on, he will, it will go into it in the commentaries on Maimonides and things like that, where it's like, well, if you don't know how to swim, then you don't have to dive in. In fact, you shouldn't, because then you're not doing anyone any good, and that's an unacceptable level of risk. So some risk, yes. But the degree of risk, you're right, what that degree is isn't entirely there. Right. Right. Jonathan here, President asked about donating a kidney, which actually was our one in advance question. So we will, in fact, try and hit that as well. Bandits attacking him or a bad animal, chaya ra'a, does imply a level of risk, and maybe a not trivial level of risk. Indicating that there is that there is a degree of risk that's supposed to be taken on. Though on some level, a lot of that stuff strikes me as the what I think of as the Sunday school style stuff. Like, oh yeah, Judaism loves saving lives. Oh, that saving life is paramount in Jewish thought, et cetera, et cetera. That's a sort of easy stuff. The question is, where would the debate take place? And a lot of it stems from a conflicting mitzvah, or what could conceivably be a conflicting mitzvah, right? It's one thing just to say such and such is a value, but the real fun of this stuff, or what makes it of greater interest is a sense of what happens when two mitzvot collide and you have two conflicting positive values. So what's the conflicting positive value in this case? That's text number 4, which is from Devarim. Lo talin neviloto alait. Don't, in a case where capital punishment has been administered, meaning somebody's committed a capital crime, they murdered somebody, whatever the case could be, and the court sentenced them to death. He must not let his corpse remain on the stake overnight or hang overnight, whether it means hanging or impaling on a stake, not entirely clear, whichever one is. You might let his corpse remain on the stake overnight or hanging from the tree, but you must bury him the same day. For an impaled body is an affront to God, you shall not defile the land that Adonai your God is giving you to possess. This is the source for prompt burial. Why am I bringing something about capital punishment? Because we learned the Kal Vachomer from this, right? An a fortiori argument from a minor situation to a major situation, which is to say that if we're forbidden from disrespecting the corpse of an individual who has just been executed for having definitively committed a capital crime, all the more so, are you supposed to give the same respect to a body of somebody who hasn't done such a thing? So the rabbis read this as this is the extreme case. This is a situation where you might think, oh, we're going to disrespect this person because we just took his life. And you want to make an example of whatever it might be. No, the answer is bury him promptly. So if the case is bury him promptly, even in the case of capital crime, all the more so everyone else, right? That is the Torah source for prompt burial, a major Jewish principle that you might not have guessed stems from this verse, but it stems from this verse, or at least that's the textual support for it. Rashi, who this translation goes with, I mentioned, could be impaled, could be hanged, because assuming that the person who is hanged or the individual who's been executed, text number 5, is a Kalel Elohim, is a degradation of God. It's a degradation of the divine image. For people are made in the divine image, and the Israelites are God's children. And Rashi says, Mashal, it's like a parable. Case of 2 twin brothers who are very closely resembled each other. One became king, the other was arrested for robbery and was hanged. Whoever saw him on the gallows thought that the king was hanged. This is the Talmud's example. What's he saying? We're made in the image of God. And so, anyone made in the image of God, you're supposed to treat with respect. So even a corpse is supposed to be treated with respect and not with disrespect. And the way the Torah reads this is prompt burial. Right? So these are the textual sources on prompt burial. This is ratified in the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century Code of Jewish Law, sort of makes it explicit. It's prohibited to leave the corpse unburied overnight, unless they left him overnight for the sake of his honor, i.e. to provide from coffin or shrouds, or professional lamenting women, on the order that relatives should have time to come or to assemble surrounding townships for his funeral, right? We go through this step by step. So one, the sort of like black letter law that the Shulchan Aruch brings is bury promptly. The only reason to delay it is for the individual's honor, to provide, which is in situations, you remember, this was a little more than a year and a half ago for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's funeral, right? Delayed. Why? For her honor, right? Not out of disrespect, but out of respect. Or more common things for the average individual to give relatives time to come. Right now, usually, Uncle Chaim needs to travel in from Florida, or the kids from California, or whatever the case may be. Or for like people to gather because this is a respected person, and people need time to travel and be informed. So, and then my favorite, the professional lamenting women. This is in Middle Eastern culture, and if I'm not mistaken, to this day.
Not just Middle Eastern.
Not just Middle Eastern. Also, you said
It's a big deal in Ireland.
A big deal in Ireland.
In English actually comes from clean, which is the Irish for lament.
They so mekonanot, the one who's key, the ones who keen, they would to show your grief, there were women who would come to wail and to cry at the funeral to show how broken up everybody is. This is the the opposite version of the bat mitzvah party dancers, like people hiring professional dancers to get everyone in the mood. Like, I actually think it's a version of that. Like, they would hire professional wailers, and like as they cried and made a production of everything and carried on, so too, it sort of made it easier for you two, the way the dancers sort of like make that happen. So fascinating. This is so yes, and this, by the way, also in the Talmud you find, professional mourning women. So that I included partly because it's a black letter law, partly because professional mourning women is a nice little sociological piece. In any event, the point of it is prompt burial. Pause. Questions? That's the conflicting value. Respect for life versus Torah command to bury promptly. The notice already in the Shulchan Aruch, they sort of like saying there are situations where you don't bury promptly. In Israel, the custom, of course, is to bury same day, as it is here. In the U.S., it's exceedingly rare for same day. 24 hours can happen, 48 more common. Next section. Possible issues that come up with this. The Talmud, in discussing about that it's prohibited to derive benefit, to try to from an idolatrous offering, meaning that if somebody takes their crop, their food, and says, "I dedicate this to Baal," or whatever false god they want to dedicate it to, you're not supposed to then take it and sell it because that's been dedicated for a bad purpose, and you're not supposed to benefit from it. Says that, and the point here in this text is that they also say you're not supposed to derive benefit from a corpse either, meaning that this image of God that belongs to God, you're not supposed to derive benefit from whatever that might have been in ancient times. I don't know, but the point being, they prohibited it. So that's the other thing, meaning, do we have a mitzvah of not only prompt burial, but also prohibiting benefit from a human body for this purpose? So these are the problematizing texts. If you look at, so we don't need to go into go that deep into the weeds, but they bring a proof text from the book of Psalms. They join themselves onto Baal Peor and ate the offerings to the dead. In the Psalms, offerings to false gods is linked with offerings to the dead, and they're learning Zevchei Metim. And so they derive the link from there, from the dead and idolatrous offerings being next to each other in the verse in the Psalms. They say that teaches this other thing. So we're not going to go deep in the weeds on that. The larger issue being that they have a principle of not deriving benefit from.
So we need to keep this one in mind as we go a little bit farther and derive benefit from a corpse to retrieve organs. So we need to keep this one in mind.
Right. So this is exactly the potential problematizing aspect of it. However, by the time this becomes relevant in a modern context, here, the sort of a prime example from it of Israel Yehuda Unterman, one of the first chief rabbis of Israel, says regarding the question of whether the law permits surgical removal of tissue from a dead body, subsequently to be transplanted as an organic part of the living, find the matter to be simple. Since these procedures constitute preservation of life, there's no difficulty. After all, weighty Torah prohibitions are set aside for the preservation of life. Hence, such surgical procedures conducted to save a life are absolutely permitted. So what's he saying? He's saying that that when two principles conflict, you need a system of what you're going to allow to supersede, what's going to supersede the other. And here he says, look, we have long precedent that issues of saving a life supersedes other mitzvot. The most famous one that most any Jew who shows up at shul knows, which is Well, right there in the Shulchan Aruch, this is text number 9. Mitzvah. For somebody who has a dangerous illness, it is a commandment. It is a mitzvah to break Shabbat for them. One who hurries to do this is praised. And one who, like in the moment, asks about it, is a murderer, sheds blood, which is to say, the person who stands around being, is this really a case where I'm supposed to break Shabbat for you? That person is considered a murderer. I mean, you're not supposed to stand around asking questions. Is this really rising to the case of if there is a question, then do it and figure out whether or not you should have done it later. Right? This is using super, super, super strong language, right? Like it's not that it is permitted to break Shabbat, it is a mitzvah. It is obligatory. And if you do it, that's awesome. And if you don't, that's horrible. So this is sort of like the general principle going on, like that when you have a conflicting values, this is a perfect example of how we learn this. And by the way, the proof text that the Shulchan Aruch is coming from comes from a familiar verse, because the Torah says in a verse you may have heard, Ve Shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat. The children of Israel shall keep Shabbat, shall guard Shabbat. And the Talmud says, why do you need to tell me that? I've been commanded elsewhere to keep Shabbat. Why are you telling me this? And the answer is that you keep Shabbat, that you break Shabbat in order to keep Shabbat, to keep future Shabbats, meaning that if you need to break Shabbat this week so that you stay alive to keep it next week, then do it. That's an obligation. So that's one of the Talmudic rabbis learns it from that verse, from Vishamru. And another one learns it from the verse that Rabbi Shishi started out with tonight, with V'chai b'chem. You should live by the commandments, live by them and not die by them. So that's by way of saying the most of the problems of like organ donation tend to be swatted away quickly with that rush, which is to say, like they're not, Shabbat is one of the central commandments. So if that is superseded by saving a life, so to most other mitzvot, almost every other. Now, the modern perspectives. We'll both draw heavily from a tshuva, a halachic paper by Rabbi Joseph Krauser from 1995 on post-mortem organ donation. So this is on, we've asked, what about while alive and while alive? We'll first deal with post-mortem organ donation. Krauser writes, there was a great reluctance in the early years of the transplant era, indeed, to mandate or even to allow donation due to fears regarding determination of the donor's death. This is then a new problematic issue, which is to say, if everyone up to the chief rabbi of Israel agrees that you're supposed to donate organs and that issues like benefiting from a dead body or prompt burial are sort of like easily trumped by issues of saving a life, the next issue is, what is the moment when the potential donor has died? Because in order to take an organ that is fit for transplant, it can't be taken from a body dead or long dead, meaning the whole possibility of, say, sort of this, what Alan asked at the outset, a heart transplant is has to be taken from, like, time is of the essence. So questions of determining the moment of death is really where the rubber hits the road in this question. It's not what the question that usually comes to me, which is aren't you supposed to bury promptly? Because again, that is sort of really easily punted away. The question is moment of death. Using brain death as a medical, much less halachic determinant of death dates only the 22nd World Medical Assembly held in 1968. Brain death is defined as permanent functional death of the centers of the brain that control the breathing, people, and other vital reflexes, which is to say, and people who know more about medicine can sort of throw in, previous to the late 60s and then becoming law in the US in I think 1980, in most states, the definition of death was primarily drawn around permanent cessation of respiratory function. And that's what most halachic sources indicate, which is to say ancient sources determine life and death based on whether or not respiratory function was present, whether or not the individual was still breathing. From the late 60s forward, it became much more common to define death as the cessation of higher and lower brain function. Higher brain functions are speech and sort of conscious thought. Lower brain stem functions being things that are done automatically, like breathing. The cessation of both, not just the one, not just higher brain stem function. That indicates that death has taken place, and that it is going to come quickly and irreversibly. And while respiratory function might continue, it will continue only briefly, and it is more akin to nervous impulses continuing even after death has taken place. The most familiar, lahavdil, it's a different situation, but like the familiar image that would come to people's head is, of course, the chicken running with his head cut off, right? That the chicken is clearly dead, yet can appear outwardly to be alive. Why is that? Because there's still nerve endings firing, but death has already taken place, and the illusion of being alive shouldn't be confused with actually being alive. So lahavdil, it's not the greatest comparison, but probably one that's easy to call up in your head. Rabbinic proponents of such a definition of death, that is a total cessation of brain and brainstem activity, is indicated among other diagnostic methods by an isolectic or flat EEG. Includes Rabbi Seymour Siegel, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who many of you read and writes prominently on the on issues of life and death, a book by that title. From Israel Reisner, David Lincoln, all of the Rabbinical Assembly, and Moshe Tendler, preeminent Orthodox authority on Jewish medical ethics, as well as the chief rabbinate of Israel. Tendler, it's a Rosh Yeshiva, right? All rabbinic authorities agree that the classic definition of death in Judaism is the absence of spontaneous respiration in a patient with no other signs of life. Brain death is a criterion for confirming death in a patient who already has irreversible absence of spontaneous respiration. So saying that the brain death is an advance indicator that this is taking place, and that even though respiration is still taking place, death has already happened. Why is this important? Because that's the moment when the organs can be transplanted. If the patient is still alive, then you can't take the organs, because then that's considered murder in the Jewish tradition. Some of the texts that we didn't bring are that in many traditions, right? So not speaking of anyone else, but like certainly in the Jewish tradition, like you can't do anything to you're not supposed to judge quality in that sense, that you're not supposed to take take organs from a living person, it can only be from somebody who isn't living. So definition of the point of death is significant. If you define death as ceasing respiration, it makes the window for taking organs to transplant, it makes it a crack. It makes it very difficult. Prowser continues, it should be noted that determination of brain death is often made while the deceased appears to be breathing and have a pulse due to the use of a mechanical respirator. Because of course the respirator can keep the physical process of breathing going on for a significant length of time. Where brain death where brain death is determined, those misleading data in no way constitute life. Quite to the contrary, it might be forbidden to continue artificial means of life in these conditions, since it would in fact be hanalata met, a delay in burying a dead person. Writing in 1975, Rabbi Emanuel Jakovich, who is the Orthodox chief rabbi of Great Britain, pointedly discusses the implications of this issue. Jakovich writes, the question of defining the moment of death with precision has been rendered both more difficult and more crucially acute by the demand for viable cadaver organs for transplant purposes. The lapse of only a few minutes may spell the difference between success and failure in such operations. On the other hand, the premature removal of organs from the dying may hasten the death and constitute murder. That's Jakovich. Greater familiarity with the practice of transplantation, as well as a broader medical and rabbinical literature on determination of death and brain death, have largely eliminated this concern. Prevalent pre-modern fears of false death are no longer compelling. The final moments of the donor's life are safeguarded by requirements that the two physicians certify death, that these physicians not be involved in the transplant procedure. In other words, so there's no conflict of interest. So I bring this in part because that the real issue is there, is the determination of the moment of death. If I sort of like read also, this is a conservative source that clearly considers brain death the determining factor. I read a book of Reform response on the issue, and he quotes two Orthodox authorities to indicate that there's broad consensus on this, though not unanimous. There are those, primarily in the Orthodox world, who disagree. That brain death is not determinant of death, that it is respiratory death, as the sources seem to indicate. Those who say, Jonathan asked on what basis? Those who say that there are those, Tendler, Jakovich, Krauser, that say that brain death is a more precise indicator or it is a precise indicator of that the respiration is not a function of life, but rather again, just could be triggered by the respirator, by the presence of a respirator, or is soon going to end. And then those who say, no, as long as there's breathing, that's life, period, end of story. Brain death is not a criterion.
Those
Should
are
unmute
codes
yourself.
that you've seen.
Mhm.
Did you see that it was more about the time of the definition of death?
Time of death.
Or nothing to do with the kavod?
Nothing to do. It is almost impossible to find a Jewish source, or I couldn't find a Jewish source on kavod hamet, on saying that, oh, you should bury promptly. No one says that. The only question that I could find is this question. To the point of, I'm going to transfer it to RICC in a moment, but like you can look up the HODS, the Halachic Organ Donor Society, which is nothing but a collection of Orthodox rabbis saying, donate your organs. And if you look, there's this huge list of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, of Orthodox rabbis, from modern Orthodox rabbis to guys who are Rosh Yeshiva deep in the West Bank, like across the spectrum, saying it is showing their organ donor card. There is, and on the other side, if you look on this side of the screen, on the right side of the screen, there's essentially one or the other. They check the box of brain death or respiratory. Most have brain death as their criterion. But lots of prominent Israeli, American, European, Australian, you name it, tons and tons and tons and tons of people. It's not controversial. And that's why, so I'm bringing this, like, should you say, this is just your liberal, rabbis here in Bridgewater saying it, it's not just us. This is HODS, the Halachic Organ Donor Society. So why you've been told your whole life that Jews don't donate their organs? It is a Baba Maisa, for lack of a more politically correct term. That's why we're doing this. It's like literally, again, HODS.org, the Halachic, like it is. I don't know, like the next text that I bring here, this is from Glinken, the head of the Israeli Rabbinical Assembly for many years. It is not merely permissible for a Jew to bequeath his organs for transplantation following his death. It is a mitzvah for him to do so in order to save one life or several lives. Yeah, so that's why I'm doing this. It is super important. And when it comes up in conversation, oh, I heard you're supposed to be, it's Jews don't do this. Not true. It is checked on my driver's license. And
Yeah, so in some, the other
Unmute
things
yourself.
didn't come up in any of the research that I did. Let me unmute myself here.
Can I ask a question?
Any of the research that I did is where that comes from. So, for example, when my uncle had his leg taken off during World War II, it was buried in my grandfather's grave, so that when the inevitable rising of the dead happens, when Mashiach comes, his whole body would be reunited with itself for bodily resurrection. So there is this sense, and it came up nowhere. I looked for it because that was my impression, was not about kavod hamed and taking care of a dead body, and nothing about what time and how we determine death, but this idea that if I donate a piece of me, when the Messiah comes and I am bodily resurrected, I won't have all of my pieces again. Now, my whole take on that is if the Messiah can resurrect all of us, the Messiah will figure out the pieces, right? Not to be joking about it, but this idea that that seems a little bit of a low barrier in terms of how we live our lives in this world. But I couldn't find that anywhere. But that's what I was what I was taught when I was growing up.
I think that's good. I think that's probably exactly it. We do have a tradition, and it's a real one. It's not fake. CC indicates that if, God forbid, one loses a limb, which obviously was more common in previous eras, that gets buried, and ideally buried with you for the time of resurrection. But of course, yeah.
Well, is that where the whole Bubba Mice? I mean, I remember growing up hearing
if the dead are going to be resurrected, then like reanimating an arm shouldn't be like that. That's not the most impressive miracle going on there, right?
And
Jewishly, I'm unmuting again, and Jewishly speaking, v'chai bahem, again, that the preference is to worry about olam hazeh, this world, more than we worry about olam haba. Yes, we want to accrue the mitzvah points for olam haba and all of these other things. It does play into our theology and into the world that Jews have created, but there is a strong preference for changing things in this world, not the world to come.
Rabbi,
if that was your concern. There is actually, by the way, a whole book that I have not been able to locate that I once learned from about Hilchot Tchiyat HaMetim. Side note, it's about the laws about what happens when the Messiah comes and we inevitably are resurrected bodily. That actually deals with tshuva like this. But I haven't been able to find a copy of this book I once learned from. So a little esoteric.
Rabbi, a question. We've been talking about saving.
If you want to do more of the
We've been talking about saving a life.
Yeah.
What about something like cornea transplant?
more of the Pauser Tshuva.
Okay. Yeah, just
right.
wasn't sure if right. So, okay. So I took a look at the Prausner, the Teshuvah, the responsum on this from our movement. And, he goes into some really interesting things. And I think one of the questions that came up that we did talk a little about, we haven't really addressed, that I was actually fascinated about, was the distinction between exactly what Jack asked at the very beginning, was in his Teshuvah, about this idea that what's the difference between post-mortem donation of organs or recovery of organs. The word harvesting, he actually doesn't love because it has this sort of a violent sort of feel to it when really we're recovering those organs for future use. He talks a lot about more than one of me, is too many of me. He talks a lot about the distinction between that and, say, donating your kidney because you can. He doesn't say that is bad, but he actually curiously writes that in order to, there is such an impetus on people with loved ones who need organs to make sacrifices to their own health and well-being. Now, one can donate a kidney and live a very happy, long life, but that there's this onus on them. And in order to sort of, and that puts them in a danger. And if we go back to those original sources that we looked at, that we led with, this idea of, yeah, you're going to assume some level of danger and some level of risk to save another life. It's part of the deal. But if we don't have to, we minimize the risk to life. So he argues that by allowing for a more liberal use of postmortem organ donation, there will be less of a need for family members to donate organs while they are living for their family members. So I thought that was kind of a curious piece that I wanted to make sure we brought up. But he makes a very, very strong case. Literally in the responsum, there is a link on the Rabbinical Assembly page to the page for organ donation to fill out your card, to make sure that it is clear in your living, in your directives and your living wills and in your wills, that it is clear to your loved ones not to block this. Because it is, as we said, by all of these sources, not just something you want to do and something that's nice to do, but it's a mitzvah. And another Baba Maisa that we'll put off right now, a mitzvah is not a good deed. It's not something nice to do. A mitzvah is people in the room, an obligation, a commandment. It's what God wants us to do. So there is this sense of God wants us to do this. So it's very easy to fill out the card. It's very easy to make sure when you get your driver's license taken care of, you can check the box on the back to make sure that the gift of life and fulfilling this mitzvah of taking care of others' lives is fulfilled. A couple other things from this I'll close with from the responsum itself. Just he spends a good deal of time talking a little bit about, like I said, this idea of making sure that the onus isn't on living folks to make sure that we supply these organs when we want to. And he just talks a lot about this impetus in Judaism to make sure that life is lived to its fullest, and that we have the moral obligation to see that through. One more thing I highlighted, hang on. Right. He says something, talking about why we've heard growing up, why people are reluctant. And he says the most decisive factor is this reluctance has simply been the widespread aversion to any interference with the dead among most Jews. In general, this aversion reflects entirely appropriate devotion to venerable religious principle and should be commended. He's talking there specifically about this idea that, we honor the dead. We make sure their bodies are guarded. When someone passes away, there are shomrim, there are guards watching their bodies to make sure that they are tended to and not left to just sit out. We make sure to bury as quickly as we can. That's our way of showing respect. As Rabbi Dan said, there are other ways of showing respect in other cultures and other communities, but the whole idea is that we are sort of wrapped into this idea of preserving the body, making sure the body returns to the ground in an honorable way. That has colored a lot of how we view organ donation, to the detriment of fulfilling a mitzvah of saving a life. So with no further ado, there is this card that you can fill out. It is right here on the page. I suppose we could put that in the chat. Did you put that in the chat? You did? Yep. Okay. Yeah.
We'll put the link in the chat. I'll pause for a second if people have questions they want to ask. Otherwise, I'll move on to the earlier question.
Rabbi?
Pardon me? Yeah, go ahead.
Rabbi? I have a question.
Sorry, but I was muted. Or my computer is muted. Sorry, go ahead.
We've been talking about saving a life. What about something like corneal transplant? Something where it's to help someone who is not in danger of losing a life, but to have a better quality of life.
Correct. So,
But I skipped it because I things freak me out.
oh, the question was, what about things like corneal transplants, where where it's not like directly saving a life in the literal sense, but rather it's not a life and death, it's enhancing or making life. Wait a minute, it is in there?
He mentions corneal, and I skipped it because for those who don't know, I have phobia of anything with eyes.
No, I understand. where is it? I should search it up. I believe recommended, though I don't want to say much more than that off the top of my head, because it's not leaping to mind. The logic, though, would be similar, so that it's not. So the easy battle way is of stomping on any problematic issues is to save a life, but that doesn't mean that it's the only one. It just means that that's the category killer. So then the question is, would benefiting an individual with something like sight, or Gail's question in the potentially for something like for scientific research, is this is that also a benefit that is greater than this? Is that mitzvah then greater than this other mitzvah, right? Like in this question of conflicting mitzvot. Certainly for something like corneal transplants, my gut would be yes, for the same reason. You're really enhancing human life in a deep and meaningful way. And in the end, especially in America, it is rare for somebody to be buried same day. In Israel, people are buried same day usually. In America, rarely. So all the more so, it doesn't seem to be doing that badly.
So
For you guys, I took one for the team and I read it, and I'm going to be horribly traumatized. But it does say that for their purposes, granting sight to those who cannot see is a case of pikuach nefesh. So they put it in the life-saving category. It does go on to talk about skin and skin grafts. I'm going to not read that. So.
Donating a body for science is a different topic, though one that is potentially more problematic because of the length of time, involved and things like that, and is, to my knowledge, and I haven't looked at this in a little while, different in situations where, God forbid, somebody has a unique condition for which there are few opportunities for research, as opposed to a situation where that wouldn't be the case. So that's one thing. The earlier question was one of the let me try and find the right thing here, of issues of post-mortem organ donation and pre-mortem organ donation in situations where somebody where there isn't it's not after death, it's when somebody's still alive, like a kidney. So this is it is really something of a separate topic. I want this, even though I titled it organ donation, like we really, even though we title it that, like it really is focusing, as you see, on postmortem, because that's the question I get most often. For things like premortem, it is there's something of a debate. And the most powerful bit on this is a talk, an Eli talk, which is the Jewish community equivalent of a TED talk. Talks on Jewish topics by Jewish thought leaders. There's an Eli talk you can get that you can find by Rabbi Shmuel Yankovitz. If you joined me on Shabbat morning for Pirkei Avot, you recognize him. I read his I take from his Pirkei Avot commentary. And he gave an Eli talk where, and this on your screen is a source sheet for it, but you can also just take it from YouTube. I'll put it in the chat, the link in the chat. And he gives a powerful 15-minute talk, and in the TED Talk style of called "How Far Will You Go to Give," where he talks about donating a kidney, first come, first serve. I've got two. It's unlikely I'm going to need two. There's somebody out there who could potentially die because they don't even have one. And it is, and my odds are very great that though it's a surgical procedure, that it won't significantly harm me, and it's unlikely that I will ever that this will cause me long-term harm. And so he, as a relatively young man and as a father of young children, goes in and donates a kidney. Not to a relative, but just out there. He says, because it's a mitzvah. And
Does this talk happen? Has it happened?
yes, no, if you, yes, there are pictures. He has pictures in the YouTube video of him in the hospital and of him talking in the hospital. It's super powerful. So it is not a universal. He is a sort of like left-leaning, in every sense of the term, modern Orthodox rabbi. And his conclusion is that this is not standing idly by, that we, even if you don't know the person in need, you know the person exists, and just because they're not in front of your face doesn't mean your obligation isn't there. And so you should. I am very impressed by him, but he says, yeah, you won't go as far as mitzvah, but this is like a recommended, recommends it. Because the risk isn't, the risk at this point in time isn't, for the average person, isn't so significant. So that totally worth pulling up. Yeah, it's really.
I've seen, I've done a number of other synagogues where they'll do like the bone marrow thing,
Right.
with the idea being that it's the same kind of premise that you do this, that
Right.
cause you fatal harm.
I actually haven't clicked on it. So Jonathan here is asking about bone marrow testing, things like that. Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, our colleague Eliana Yolkut, who came here and did my installation, for those of you who have been around, like 7 years ago, we're on the 2nd anniversary of my 5th anniversary. She just in the last year donated marrow to somebody, ended up there's a match in Israel,
I'm on the list.
and saved a life. Yeah. So, and that's not, it's not, again,
Painful.
it's painful. It's not no risk. It's not no time. That's a thing. This isn't donating blood. It's a thing. But yeah, Hareza Mishubach, as the Shulchan Aruch says about things, it is a praiseworthy thing to do.
Sorry, you're talking about the list of Orthodox rabbis. I was just remembering, when I discussed recently, I saw a lot of online groups and I read about kosher all the time. And I was reading how there's this one, I'm going to name it. There's that law where if you have a restaurant and someone lights your stove and they're not Jewish, that's not a sign up for it. It says this person was not, our stove was lit by someone who was not Jewish. And it's a certain designation. You have to have a sign out front. This is,
Right. Bishul Akum.
I'm wondering, as far as organization goes, is there any disposition from the Orthodox rabbis about either the recipient or the donor?
Should the donor be, should the recipient or the donor be Jewish or not Jewish? I don't think that, I don't know of any source that says otherwise, that you shouldn't. The guiding text on this would be, this is, you should turn off the YouTube feed because this is the offensive Jewish tradition part of it, but we'll say it out loud anyway, which is to say that in the sources, you're commanded to, if the building collapses on somebody, you're supposed to save the people inside, even when it's Shabbat, right? So in other words, save life on Shabbat. And there are voices in the sources, dominant voices, that say that you dig through the rubble to find somebody who's underneath the rubble on Shabbat, even though digging on Shabbat is not permitted, but only if that person is Jewish. Not if that person is not Jewish, meaning like don't bother saving the life of the non-Jew on Shabbat. This is part of the tradition. I'm just being honest of that is there. And then another voice comes in and says, and even though the law is you shouldn't do it anyway, save the non-Jew's life on Shabbat, mipnei darchei shalom, because of the ways of peace, which is to say, it seems to be what they're saying is that, look, you're really not supposed to do it. But you know what? If you don't do this, things are going to get real bad real quick. So even though the way we read the law is that you're not supposed to, do it anyway, because if you want to get along with the rest of the world, this is what you have to do. So I would say at the very least, if there were somebody who said that you shouldn't, that the donor class should be Jewish or whatever the case may be, that even then that would be taken off the table, mipnei darchei shalom, because you're supposed to carry yourself in a way that people don't hate you. And if you're acting like a jerk, people are going to hate you. Or if you like act like you don't care about anyone else's lives besides your own group, people are going to hate you. So, right. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So the same thing, like that. You said saying that, what about the pausing to help an ill person? You're a murderer. You're as one who sheds blood. If you pause to ask questions, same thing. You're not supposed to be checking their breech, so to speak, to find out whether they're Jewish or not. Like again, like obviously, like there's an overarching thing here. So there are ugly parts of the tradition. May as well be honest about it. And there are more beautiful parts of the tradition. Easy to be honest about those. So yeah, but either way, you sort of have to land at the same conclusion. Obviously, things like bone marrow, like those tend to be genetic. So yeah, Ashkenazi Jews are, we're in this, genetic ghetto. No, don't. You don't need to find a Jewish person for a donor for you or anything like that. Like all good. And that's a great Shmuel Yankowicz's example. He's giving first come, first serve, doesn't matter who it is. All human beings created in God's image. That's our guiding text from the start. And so all human life created in God's image. Jews aren't created in God's image. People are created in God's image. So all of that is sort of like worthy of saving. There's one more link that came to mind when you're asking that. So in terms of donors, that's all. Somebody also asked, it's a different topic, but I was asked about pig organ transplants and things like that. All the more so, like you're not supposed to eat pig, but if you need it to live, the guiding principle is anything you need to live, you should live. All right. So with that, a few links out there. Answer is yes. The reason we've been told otherwise is sort of like it was Rabbi Sisi addressed well, I think. But the answer is yes. You're supposed to do it. The questions of determination of death, that's the only question. Everything else is pretty clear. What's thoughts? That's good. All right. So this, I recommend the Shmuel Yankowitz video that I put in the chat, or it's fascinating. And with that, everyone should stay well. Take care of yourself.